Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Wolfgang Hurst, and I will be giving this presentation on behalf of the first author, Nina Rosa, who unfortunately cannot make it today, but she deserves most, if not all, of the credit for this work. The work is part of her PhD thesis, and it is preliminary insofar as it presents a first and initial step towards a larger goal, which is to gain a better understanding of the so-called rubber hand illusion. Now, I assume that most of you are familiar with the rubber hand experiment. It is an experiment where you hide a person's hand from their sight, but instead they are looking at an artificial rubber hand. And then the rubber hand, as well as their real hand, are synchronously stimulated with the same haptic sensation. And then, even if you know that what you're looking at is just an artificial hand, this combination of visual and tactile stimuli tricks the brain into believing that the artificial hand is theirs and that they can really feel the haptic sensation that it is exposed to. And in technical terms, this is commonly referred to as ownership. Now, this experiment has been done with different variations and also under different conditions, including mediated scenarios such as VR and to a lesser degree also AR. In our group, we are indeed mostly interested in AR, where knowing about ownership of a virtual hand can be important. For example, when you're controlling a remote hand that interacts with the augmented environment, because there is evidence that ownership can also have a huge impact on performance. There are some studies that confirm the rubber hand illusion also works in AR, although here the situation is a bit different since we generally do not hide our real hand but have it in plain sight or at least see it in our peripheral view as well. Another important thing to consider is that the rubber hand illusion does not always work. There is a larger amount of people who do not experience it at all. And even for the ones who do, the results can vary strongly. And this is, of course, now the part that we want to study in more detail. And we do expect that more individual characteristics, and in particular so-called immersive tendencies, play a key role here. So what we did and what we present as contribution in our paper is that we introduced a model that extends existing models about ownership based on a literature study. And then we did a first experiment that does, of course, not fully prove this model, but the results support it and suggest its validity. Now, existing models for ownership in relation to the rubber hand illusion are generally based on how our brain integrates such synchronous multisensory stimulations, and they use a combination of bottom-up and top-down approaches for this. But as I said, these kind of models do not consider or explain individual differences, that is, the large variability that we often see in the results. But there is some evidence that personality can play a role in ownership as well. So there are a few scientific studies that which suggest that. Now, since we are focusing on mediated experiences, so VR and AR, we also looked into another aspect that is relevant in this context, and that is presence or spatial presence, so the experience of really being there. And this aspect is very well researched with respect to different media and user variables, and their impact on the experience has been proven. And this is why we basically propose to integrate some of these into models of ownership as well, namely those parameters that might also make sense in the context of ownership. For example, there is no real reason why we would assume that suspension of disbelief or absorption play a role in ownership, although they have high impact on presence, but it is not unlikely that, for example, immersive tendency has an impact too. So immersive tendency is a term describing an individual's capability to become immersed in any kind of experience or situation. Now, for spatial presence, Wirth et al. Proposed a two-level approach where in the first step a user constructs a spatial situation model for the mediated space, and that is then followed by a second level, which is a more explicit hypothesis testing. So an informal example for the first step, that is the creation of this situation model, would be the question, is this a room? And a related hypothesis that is tested once this situation model is accepted would then be, am I in this room? And if the answer to that question is yes, then of course it is obviously we have a high level of presence. And our model now basically applies this to ownership as well. So an informal example in this case would be, is this a limb, for example, an arm or a hand? And a related hypothesis would then be, this is my arm or my hand, it belongs to me, I own it, I have ownership over this arm or hand. And we believe now that some of the characteristics that are used to test presence are also relevant in this second level hypothesis testing when it comes to ownership, and can thus explain the large variation of results across individuals. And the first one that we tested is, as said, immersive tendency. So as a first step to verify if our proposed model can really explain what is going on with respect to ownership in an AR scenario, we did a small follow-up study to some previous work. And in that previous work, we tested ownership with respect to different conditions, in particular synchronous visual tactile and synchronous visual motor stimulation, since those were the two where we could prove ownership for most participants. So visual tactile is clear, that's the standard condition that you have for the rubber hand illusion, and the visual motor simulation is particularly relevant for AR, since it addresses a synchronous motion of both the real hand and the virtual one, and this has shown, it was shown that this is essential to create ownership. Now, for these conditions, we then looked at the answer that the participants gave for the question that was most related to ownership. That is, it seemed as if the virtual hand was my hand. And then we compared their answers to their ratings of the so-called Immersive Tendency questionnaire, which is an established way to verify immersive tendency. I copied it here, so you see that it contains questions that all suggest that they have a high level of immersive tendency if they give a high rating for those questions. So the questions were answered with a 5-point Likert scale. Unfortunately, only 23 of the 30 people could participate in this follow-up study, but that should still be enough to draw conclusions. Here are the results to the 3 questions that showed the clearest trends. Now I'm saving myself the trouble of going through all of them, since you can find all the details in the paper. And I will definitely save me and you from a long discussion about the statistical analysis, since again, this is all described in detail in the paper. But I will directly jump to the main conclusion here at the bottom, which is that as we hoped, there is a clear evidence that is also statistically significant that ownership does indeed increase for people with high immersive tendency. So in conclusion, for the rubber hand experience in VR and AR, we proposed a 2-level processing model that is motivated by related work about presence. In this model, the first level describes the processes that go on in our brain when constructing a tentative model of the artificial limb, so for example, the arm or hand. And the second level then describes the testing of the hypothesis that this is your limb, that you own it. And that second level is the new introduction or contribution of our work, which we verified at least partly by proving that immersive tendency has an impact on the experience of ownership. And for the future work, of course, we should also verify other variables. And we're also thinking about extending our tests to not only body parts, but also full body experiences and variations of limbs. All right, that's about it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now, or feel free to email me either me or the first author about it. Thank you.